In this world, the most powerful young woman is Sierra Perrine, a girl not yet 20 years old. The young gentleman was enchanted by Lady Perrine and took great pleasure in sharing with her stories about his family, renowned for their wealth and influence. Others who knew them held the family in high esteem, describing them as remarkable. Just then, another gentleman approached and also praised the Count's daughter, commenting on her extraordinary beauty. Sierra, daughter of the famous Count Perrine, was truly striking, which led to her nickname, White Magnolia. As they continued the conversation, a newcomer interrupted, visibly displeased by the admiration others had for Sierra. She harshly told them to stop talking nonsense, which outraged the gentleman, one of whom remarked that she wasn't even worthy of Lady Sierra's attention. The impolite lady quickly walked away, calling them foolish. After she left, the young gentleman noticed that Sierra's health seemed to be declining, but his mother dismissed it, thinking she was merely pretending to garner attention. This upset the two men, and the lady silently departed as well. None of them could believe that Lady Perrine might not be as innocent as they assumed. They all regarded her as a fragile, delicate flower, taking great care to protect her. However, the main character kept everyone at a distance, believing she was truly innocent and pitying her, dreaming of nothing more than the chance to kiss her hand. When news of Sierra's illness reached the palace, Prince Leonardo, who had noticed her frequent sickness, decided to send her tulips as a gift. His servant, however, was puzzled by the prince's request, as it was winter, and finding tulips at that time seemed impossible. He picks up a pen and writes a letter to Lady Sierra, expressing his feelings of regret for not being able to visit her in person. He also shares his concerns about her health, which troubles him daily. After writing the letter, the prince hands it to his servant, instructing him to deliver it along with some flowers to Lady Sierra. The head servant, noticing the prince, asks when he plans to get married. The prince, slightly surprised by the question, asks whom he is supposed to marry. When told he should marry Lady Perrine, he smiles softly. Despite his feelings for her, he has no intention of forcing her into marriage, especially since they've known each other since childhood and care for each other like siblings. Meanwhile, in the grand mansion of Count Perrine, the family is informed that a doctor has arrived. The Count, clearly tired and somewhat frustrated, asks if the doctor is there to see Sierra again, as this is not the first time she's been ill. His eldest son, Vincent, who has gray hair and a serious aristocratic demeanor, confirms this. The Count leans wearily on his hand and says they'll address this later, instead turning the conversation to more important matters, like the vineyard. Vincent reports that while they've refused to sell it for now, it's only a matter of time before they do. They continue discussing family affairs. In Lady Sierra's room, the doctor is visibly anxious and urges her to listen carefully. Sierra, looking unwell, tells him not to waste time and to tell her the state of her health. She listens with mild surprise and confusion, but remains calm. Her maid, overhearing the conversation, is struck with shock and covers her mouth, struggling to hold back tears. Unable to contain herself, the maid bursts into sobs, feeling deep sympathy for Sierra. Through her tears, the maid remarks that it took Sierra 15 years to cultivate the image of a sweet, innocent girl in order to become the crown princess, but now it seems all for nothing. The main character is annoyed by the maid's sentimentality. In reality, she's quite arrogant, and her seemingly innocent persona is merely an act. As the maid continues to cry, Sierra tells her to stop, reminding her that it's she who is dying, not the maid. Sierra waves her hand in frustration, dismissing her, and orders the maid to cry elsewhere. Tired of the constant pain, she reflects on her limited time, only a month to live, and resolves to make the most of every moment. After learning from the maid that her father is in the library, Sierra gets out of bed and plans to visit him. She gives the maid a pointed look, as if to say that she knows what to do. A few minutes later, they meet in the library, with the maid deliberately appearing disheveled, so Sierra looks even more beautiful by comparison. Sierra pretends to burst into tears, apologizing for disturbing her family. Her relatives are uncomfortable, and the maid shudders under their stares. Count Marie-Eudes Perrine, famous for his kindness and refinement, had died during childbirth when Sierra's youngest sister was born, which had caused a rift in the family. The maid, feeling it is unfair, wonders how they could possibly resent Sierra for something beyond her control. Her strict father, aware of Sierra's condition, asks what she plans to do next. As Sierra once again plays up the drama, her older brother ponders silently. Her two younger brothers simply shake their heads at her behavior. Sierra had always claimed not to need anything, only to circle back around and get what she wanted, often under the guise of her father's adoration. She was talented, after all, and her actions had helped raise the family's status. Sierra speaks quietly to her father, requesting a quiet country house, 15 servants, a butler, and 10 million gold to live out her remaining days in peace. Her father and brothers stare at her, shocked into silence by her bold request. Continuing to pretend to cry, she insists that she wants her condition to remain a secret and calls the maid to leave with her. The family is left in stunned silence. Finally, her father speaks, realizing that all along, Sierra's only need had been money. Back in her chambers, Sierra grabs her head and exclaims how tired she is, to which her maid expresses her anger toward the family. They knew of Sierra's illness yet treated her with cruelty. Not understanding the maid's anger, Sierra explains that her exhaustion is from pretending to cry for so long, which was due to her lifelong strict diet. This, she realizes, had taken a toll on her health. Determined to feel better, she decides to eat more and orders the maid to bring her food. Sierra walks to the window, reflecting on how the new year has already brought such news. She finds it almost amusing, but at least she is managing to control the situation. She refuses to give up because she is a white magnolia, but she silently vows to stop pretending to be the innocent girl everyone expects her to be. The next morning, she stands before the mirror, admiring her beauty. Despite knowing she is nearing death, she is still stunning. Her maid rushes in to inform her that the carriage is ready. Today, Sierra has chosen to wear her most beautiful dress, and as she steps into the carriage, her thoughts linger on her outfit. She regrets not wearing it more often, waiting for the right moment. The maid reminds her that in an hour, she is expected at Mrs. Spears' tea party, and since they won't make it in time, she should send her apologies. Sierra dismisses the idea, saying she'll write an apology letter later. Attending tea with Mrs. Spear isn't something she enjoys, especially after the lady once proposed her son to Sierra, a man whose face she doesn't even remember. The tea party is full of eligible bachelors, including her brothers, Jeffrey and Jasper. If Sierra is absent without notice, it will be inconvenient for her brothers, but she doesn't care. She smiles to herself, pleased with the idea of them struggling, knowing they never helped her when Mrs. Spear caused her trouble. This time, she'll repay them in kind. Sophie, her maid, is pleased with her mistress's decision, believing her brothers have long deserved such treatment. The carriage moves through the beautiful city, heading toward the Perrine estate. At the tea party, guests begin questioning her brothers about Lady Sierra's health and whereabouts. One guest asks what happened, and the purple-haired lady immediately begins to investigate, noticing that Sierra hasn't arrived and her brothers seem unaware of her absence. A young man, the son of the Margrave Kaisi Herben, shows interest in Lady Sierra. He seems unaware of who she is, which the young lady notices as a lack of basic courtesy. However, she doesn't mind since Herben's family is famous for their immense wealth and their apolitical stance. The Herbens impressed the first emperor with their swordsmanship, and as a result, they were entrusted with guarding the empire's diamond and gold mines. The emperor was so fond of them that every warrior in their family was given the surname Herben and granted a title of nobility. For the next 500 years, the Herbens successfully defended the borders and maintained their status. Each generation of the family only had one son, and they visited the capital only once every 30 years when the Margrave's son was searching for a bride. Seeing an opportunity, one of the guests offers to share what they know about Lady Sierra. They reveal all sorts of details about her, including her mother's death during childbirth, and one guest points out that Sierra's brothers are absent. They've already left the tea party to visit her, which the guests find endearing. Although Kaisi is clearly out of the loop, he becomes intrigued by Sierra, who is the talk of everyone there. Meanwhile, Lady Sierra and her maid are on their way home. Sophie wonders why her mistress chose to leave her house and keep her illness a secret. Sierra, irritated, thinks that if people knew she was dying, they would swarm her with visits. She doesn't want to waste the little time she has left pretending to enjoy their company. Sophie is puzzled by this attitude, especially since Sierra had once expressed a desire for the throne, which would only lead to more interference. The main character's eyes soften, and her expression turns tender as she admits that she loves the crown prince. Surprised, Sophie asks her to clarify, and Sierra simply shrugs. Her reasoning is that she'll be dead in a month anyway, so she might as well confess her feelings now. When the carriage arrives at the Perrine mansion, the coachman helps Sierra out, but she stumbles, feeling dizzy and nearly falling. Her maid smiles, amused by Sierra's frustration and anger at her own condition. This showed that the mistress still had enough strength to be angry, which was a positive sign. Lady Sierra asked her maid to carry her to her chambers. The maid, noting that she seemed to be much weaker than her mistress, was concerned. Just then, the butler hurried in, delivering a message that the Count urgently wished to see Lady Sierra in his office. The maid, still anxious about her mistress's health, observed Sierra's reaction. Realizing that Herban had been at the tea party, Sierra figured this was the reason for her father's sudden urgency. She turned around and headed toward her chambers, now only interested in the crown prince. The butler continued to fuss, relaying that the Count insisted she join him as soon as she returned. Sierra shot him a stern look and told him to inform her father that she wished to rest and would see him later. The servants were left bewildered by her dismissal. Meanwhile, the Count sat in his office, contemplating his daughter, whose behavior had drastically changed in recent weeks. Despite many attempts to talk to her, she constantly made excuses to stay in her room and avoided him. He watched her from the window, playing in the yard with her pet. She hadn't spent time with the animal as often before, as its hair would cling to her clothes, but now she seemed to regret it. The maid voiced her concern about how long Sierra had been ignoring her father, fearing it might anger him. Sierra simply brushed it off, saying the worst that could happen was her being executed for disobedience, which would only advance her death by 28 days. Still, she instructed Sophie to inform her father that she would meet with him for exactly 30 minutes, no more. At last, the Count managed to meet with Sierra. They sat in the common room, and the Count awkwardly watched his daughter, who elegantly rested her chin in her hand, waiting for him to speak. He began by inquiring about her health, but Sierra interrupted him rudely, telling him they didn't have much time and to get to the point. The Count, taken aback, could hardly believe how different his daughter was. She used to be diligent and affectionate, but now she seemed cold and detached. Sierra bluntly explained that she wasn't going to attend social events like Mrs. Spears' tea party anymore. She asked her father if he thought she wanted revenge on them. Before he could answer, she quickly responded, stating that she never expected anything from her family, and had no reason for revenge. She had always known she wasn't treated like a true member of the family. The last 18 years of her life hadn't gone as she'd hoped, but they were still family. She didn't want to ruin their relationship over it. The Count's face darkened as he recalled his late wife's gentle and playful voice. Sierra continued, expressing her gratitude for everything her father had done for her, and explained why she had asked for a house, servants, and 10 million gold. Her goal was to restore her health and return to social life. She also mentioned that in 3 days, she was attending a ball at the Imperial Palace and planned to leave afterward. The Count stopped her, confirming that she truly was a mirror image of her late mother, the woman he had dearly loved. He awkwardly asked if she truly planned to leave, to which Sierra answered no. She then left the room. Left alone, the Count finally realized how much his daughter resembled her mother, something he had never noticed before. Determined to make things right, he resolved to persuade Sierra to stay and try to make up for what she had lacked in childhood, just to see her smile once more. Later that evening at the Perrine mansion, the butler handed the Count a letter from Sierra. In it, she wrote that she had fallen in love with the house and had already purchased it. She had moved in that very evening and requested her father send her the servants and the promised money. This upset the Count deeply, as he hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye to her. Sierra and Sophie arrived at their new home, which appeared dark and eerie. Sierra was pleased with her choice. Everything from the design to the beautiful garden, and its distance from the center, seemed perfect. However, Sophie was apprehensive and clung to her mistress, fearful of the house's history. She explained that a couple who had been forbidden to be together had committed suicide there, and she was certain the house was cursed. Sierra rebuked Sophie for indulging in her fascination with horror stories and, ignoring her maid's concerns, headed into the house. Sophie remained anxious about the furnishings, but Sierra dismissed her worries. In a light-hearted mood, Sierra expressed that if the house had ghosts, at least they could tell her what to expect after death. With only 25 days left, she wasn't afraid of what might come. The next morning, Sierra woke up in her beautiful new home. Sophie was amazed by how stunning her mistress looked, especially considering her illness. Sierra seemed to grow more beautiful each day. Not paying much attention to Sophie's praise, she asked her to help her get dressed. Sophie believed that good rest and nutrition were improving her mistress's condition. She promised that by the time of the upcoming ball, Sierra would look even more radiant. Sierra, ever confident, couldn't help but boast about her beauty. That evening at the Imperial Ball, everyone from across the Empire gathered in their finest attire. A group of young ladies, standing on the sidelines, were discussing Lady Sierra, wondering if she would attend. Her father and brothers had promised to come, and rumors had spread, with some people gossiping about her. Only Herban remained detached from all the chatter. He had heard of Sierra before, seeing her name on the list of invitees, but she had never shown up. He didn't understand the fuss about her, and didn't see why so many people made a big deal of one person, as it seemed typical of high society. He was brought out of his thoughts by the loud announcement of Lady Sierra Perrine's arrival. She entered the ballroom in a stunning red dress, immediately drawing everyone's attention. As she scanned the room, she noticed a stranger staring at her. She realized this was Herban, who was eyeing her with interest. She could see that he looked worn out and uncomfortable in such a crowd, and sensing he wouldn't last long, she walked past him without stopping. She was greeted by Mrs. Spears, who immediately complimented her dress, suspecting Sierra was using it to hide her pregnancy. Sierra, feeling Mrs. Spears was hiding something, quickly picked up on the awkwardness. She had once cared deeply about her reputation, but now, with her impending death, she didn't mind what others thought. Turning to Mrs. Spears, she asked if she didn't appear to be the same innocent, pure Sierra everyone had once known. Mrs. Spears was stunned and momentarily speechless, while the other guests were left in shocked silence. Trying to salvage the situation, Mrs. Spears awkwardly complimented Sierra's dress, but Sierra simply turned to another guest and explained that she hadn't wanted to bare her shoulders in the cold season. Her blunt response sent ripples of shock through the room, and the guests were left appalled by her boldness. Despite the tension, Sierra wished everyone an enjoyable evening before turning to leave. As she walked away, Mrs. Spears angrily called after her, but Sierra paid her no mind and continued on her way, leaving the guests muttering about her impudence. Kais, who had been observing, was disgusted by the ongoing gossip and was about to take action when the arrival of the Emperor, Empress, and Crown Prince was announced. He froze in place. Sierra, who had been standing away from the crowd by the window, looked serene and detached. When she noticed someone staring at her, she looked toward them and met Kais's gaze, causing him to flush with embarrassment. Meanwhile, other ladies were gossiping about the Crown Prince's sudden disappearance, wondering if he would return soon. As Kais turned his attention back to Sierra, she had vanished, and her place by the window was now empty. Outside by the fountain, Sierra stood with the Crown Prince. He asked her if she had received the tulips he had sent, but Sierra didn't answer. Instead, she changed the subject, reminding him that they had known each other for 15 years. The prince, surprised by this shift in conversation, laughed and recalled how they had first met when he was 7, and she was just 3. He remembered how she had been lost and crying desperately for her father in the garden. The prince had been sitting on a tree when he heard her sobbing and had climbed down to comfort her. He had knelt down and asked why she was crying. After hearing her story, he had led her to the main hall, where her father immediately scolded her for running away but then apologized to the prince. At that moment, little Sierra had declared that when she grew up, she would marry a prince. Her father, feeling embarrassed, tried to silence his daughter, but the others couldn't help but laugh, with the emperor even commenting on how brave she was. The prince smiled warmly as he remembered the past, thinking only she would dare to speak to him in such a way. Sierra, with a sudden confession, told him that she adored him, which left the prince somewhat taken aback. He hadn't expected such words from her. Sierra then looked him in the eyes and confessed that she had loved him ever since their first meeting 15 years ago. The prince was surprised by her sudden declaration, but before he could respond, Sierra quickly added that she wasn't intending to spend the night with him, or anything like that. She explained that she had always planned to confess to him, and if not now, there might never be another chance. After sharing her feelings, she simply thanked him and turned to leave. The prince, not wanting her to go, hurriedly took her hand. They locked eyes for a few seconds, and a quiet, special atmosphere enveloped them. But Sierra wasn't looking for a response from him. She only wanted to confess. After a brief farewell, she swiftly left, leaving the prince deep in thought. He couldn't understand why she had confessed and then left immediately. Alone, he watched her retreating figure, unsure of what to make of the situation. Meanwhile, someone had been hiding in the bushes, listening in on their conversation. A young lady, unable to contain her excitement, pressed her fist to her mouth. It was Walhan Mina Ritchie, the daughter of a viscount and the secret editor of the scandalous newspaper High Society Nightlife, which had been publishing sensational stories for 120 years. Despite the controversy surrounding its content, the newspaper's high sales spoke volumes. Ritchie was thrilled that Lady Sierra had finally made her public appearance, and she eagerly decided to follow her, already plotting what headline she would use for her article. She quickly left to publish it by morning. Out on the street, Kais Herban, still adjusting to the unfamiliar surroundings, spotted a familiar figure, Lady Sierra Perrine. She noticed him too and greeted him with a smile. Kais was surprised that she knew his name, and noted how happy she seemed, contrary to his earlier assumption that she would be upset about the gossip at the ball. Pleased that she had confessed to the prince before her passing, Sierra decided to offer Kais some advice. She told him not to drink too much, as he might end up with a stranger claiming that he was the father of her child. Leaning in closer to him, she warned him that love, which often starts easily, would end just as quickly. She advised him to hide his true feelings behind a smile, for a smile holds great power. Kais remained silent, and Sierra, not caring about his reaction, took the glass from his hand and began to swirl it. She asked if she was talking too much, then gulped the drink down and handed the empty glass back to him. She added that if they could somehow get rid of the emperor's family, the Herbans would become the most powerful, before leaving him. Kais felt a strange dizziness, though he hadn't had much to drink. His face flushed, and he felt an unusual warmth. Lady Wilhelmina, who had already planned to leave, noticed Sierra as she was about to depart. She thought to herself that the next day, everyone would know about Sierra's proposed alliance with the crown prince, and after that, Sierra wouldn't be able to maintain such a proud demeanor. Finally, the rest of the Perrine family arrived at the ball, with the count and his 3 sons entering. Upon spotting his daughter, the count immediately began asking about her well-being, intending to assign a guard to protect her. Sierra, however, interrupted him, saying that wasn't the main concern. She admitted she had made a mistake and decided it was time to be honest with him, no matter the consequences. Her words immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room, and all eyes turned to the Perrine family. Lady Ritchie grew anxious as she realized that Sierra was about to openly confess her love in front of everyone, which would ruin her article. As expected, Sierra, wearing a happy smile, announced to the room that she had just confessed her love to a man she had cherished for a long time. Her father and brothers were left stunned, mouths agape, unable to immediately process what they had just heard. Her father, still in disbelief, asked her to confirm it. With tears in her eyes, Sierra explained that, according to tradition, a woman should not be the first to confess love, and as a duke's daughter, she was well aware of this. She added that, given this, she should be expelled from the Perrine family. Her brothers, initially puzzled by Sierra's behavior, began to understand that she had long been hiding her true nature. The innocent image they had of her was merely a facade, and the real Sierra was much like their mother, strict and cold-blooded. Even the brothers, typically so composed, felt tears well up as they remembered their late mother. Sierra apologized to the gathered guests for her impromptu display at the royal ball, but added sarcastically that, in reality, they had all been waiting for such a spectacle. This caused an uproar among the crowd. She said that this was the side of her she would show when she had had enough of their criticism, wishing them an enjoyable time for the rest of the evening. With a smirk, she turned on her heel and left the ball, head held high. After she left, the hall fell silent for a moment, before an explosion of heated discussions erupted over what had just transpired. Lady Ritchie, still reeling from the events, clenched her fist, vowing to get revenge on Sierra. That night, Sierra, finally back in her carriage, felt a sense of relief. Everything had gone according to plan, and she had crossed off several goals. The white magnolia was gone, she had confessed her love to the prince, and she had severed ties with the Perrine family. She smiled at her reflection, satisfied with how things were unfolding. If everything continued as it had, she would soon accomplish all her objectives. The next morning, with only 24 days left, the door to Sierra's chambers burst open, waking her from sleep. Sofa rushed in, screaming about what Sierra had done. The maid was frantic, convinced that Sierra would be in danger now, because in her eyes, the Perrine family were ruthless and cold-blooded. Sierra, teasing, responded that she would only die 24 days earlier than planned, which prompted another round of frantic yelling from Sofa, who insisted that her mistress didn't deserve such a fate. Fully awake now, Sierra got out of bed and reassured Sofa that no one would kill her. In return for the favors she had received, she had been pretending to be sweet and innocent her entire life. She also mentioned that Sofa was one of the reasons she had survived so long. The maid, surprised by Sierra's words, asked her again if she truly believed that even if she faced difficulties in aristocratic society, she wouldn't lose face in the Perrine family. Sierra calmly stated that, as long as Sofa was by her side, everything would be fine. Touched, Sofa embraced her, relieved that Sierra wasn't as helpless as she had feared. There was a knock at the door, and a messenger announced that an unexpected guest had arrived for Sierra. Annoyed, Sierra initially said that she wanted nothing to do with the Perrine family anymore, but the maid insisted that only the imperial family was more powerful than this visitor. Sierra realized that it was Kais, and after a moment of hesitation, she decided to meet him. Kais was waiting in Sierra's living room when she entered, dressed elegantly. He stood up respectfully as she approached. Sierra invited him to sit down, and soon the maid brought them tea. Kais took a sip, and the atmosphere became calm and relaxed. Sierra appreciated the tea, noticing how fresh it was, especially since it had been brought to her by Kais. The young man's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but soon the room fell into an awkward silence, as it became clear that they had run out of topics to discuss. Sierra tried to keep the conversation going, but Kais struggled to respond. Kais appeared nervous, and Sierra turned to him, asking what such a powerful man could possibly want from a girl without status or family. His embarrassment was evident, making him clear his throat awkwardly. Sierra simply smiled and sat back as though nothing had happened. Kais, still red-faced, confessed that he had come to thank her for her advice. He was grateful and wanted to show his appreciation. This surprised Sierra, but she told him there was no need to repay her. He had already returned the favor, the first piece of advice with wine, and the second with tea. However, Kais didn't give up. He was still hesitant and nervous, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to ask a question. Eventually, he admitted that he wanted to become friends with her. His sincerity was clear, but Sierra, who had received many similar offers from men with ulterior motives, was cautious. She had turned down all those requests, but Kais's intentions intrigued her. She asked him if he would still want to be friends with her even if it turned out to be a fleeting friendship. Kais, looking thoughtful, responded that she was more like the wind than a flower. This answer surprised Sierra, who then playfully agreed to be friends with him, likening herself to the wind and adding that they could be friends for just 3 weeks. Despite the limited time, Kais was thrilled by the opportunity. He knew she was in love with someone else, but simply being near her for 3 weeks was enough for him. As they began their new friendship, they both felt awkward, unsure of how to communicate. Sierra admitted that she didn't have any real friends, which made Kais happy because, like her, he also lacked close friendships. Sierra suggested they revisit the topic later and figure out what friends usually do together. Kais eagerly agreed, his eyes sparkling with anticipation as he looked forward to discovering what being friends really meant. They said their goodbyes, and Kais left the house. As he stepped outside, he noticed a young man standing nearby, watching the house intently. The man, behaving strangely, expressed concern about Sierra's well-being and asked how she was doing. Kais, intrigued, agreed to answer the man's question if he could first answer his own. What do friends usually do? The man was surprised by such a simple question and responded that friends often have tea parties, go shopping together, or simply chat. Despite the man's calm demeanor, Kais couldn't resist asking, "Your Highness, what are you doing here?" The prince, pretending to be nonchalant, said that, as expected, Kais wasn't easily fooled, especially since he was the son of a margrave. He then asked Kais if he could tell him how Sierra was doing. Kais reassured the prince that Sierra was doing well and appeared much healthier, which seemed to relieve the prince. He had been worried about her frequent illnesses, and this news was a relief. The prince couldn't stop thinking about Sierra's confession the night before. Her words had haunted him, and he hadn't been able to express that he loved her too. He spent the entire night thinking about her, confused about how she had managed to slip away from him. Kais, watching the prince lost in thought, didn't understand what was happening. Just then, the Perrine family arrived, Sierra's father and 3 brothers. They were surprised to see both the prince and Kais together, and asked what they were doing there. In return, they were asked why they had come, to which the Perrine family responded that Sierra no longer belonged to them. Their faces immediately darkened at the realization. The idea that Sierra had become a stranger to them was unbearable. They had only just recognized how much she resembled their late mother, and if they had understood this sooner, they would have treated her better. The brothers felt deep regret and silently begged her for forgiveness, hoping she would spend her remaining 24 days with them. As they spoke, a young woman hid behind a tree and observed the scene. She was intrigued by the gathering of such influential men near Sierra's house. It wasn't just any group of men, it was some of the most powerful people in the empire. Among them was Miss Aimia Carnium, the only daughter of the Carnium family, a young woman whom her mother doted on excessively. At the last ball, when Sierra and Aimia had worn identical dresses, all eyes had been on Sierra, overshadowing Aimia. This ruined the event for Aimia, and she left feeling disappointed and bitter. She despised how perfectly Sierra carried herself, always so graceful and elegant. That evening, Aimia's frustration grew as she noticed a suspicious man lingering around Sierra's house. Determined to ensure Sierra's safety, Aimia decided to follow him, thinking he might harm her. However, Sierra remained unaware of Aimia's presence. Fuming, Aimia turned to leave, but just then, the main gate swung open, and the butler confidently stepped out. Everyone watching was curious about his next move. The prince assumed that Sierra had sent the butler to invite him, but to his surprise, the butler passed him by without acknowledgement, leaving him in an awkward state. The butler made his way directly to the Perrine family, who were waiting in anticipation, thinking he was coming toward them. But instead, he walked past them and approached Lady Aimia, informing her that Lady Sierra wanted to see her. Aimia initially rebelled, thinking that Sierra might be setting a trap, but when she entered the house, she was greeted by a stunningly beautiful Sierra, who welcomed her warmly. Aimia, somewhat flustered, admitted that she had been wrong to think poorly of Sierra, now realizing how gorgeous she truly looked. Sierra, in turn, acknowledged her beauty with a smile, but this only fueled Aimia's frustration, leading her to demand the real reason Sierra had called her over. Sierra called her by name and moved closer, causing Aimia to blush and become speechless. As she pondered Sierra's beauty up close, Sierra repeated her question, and Aimia finally gave a reluctant but positive answer. Sierra smiled with satisfaction, pleased that she now had a friend. If she were going to have one, it made sense to have a girlfriend, as a way of maintaining balance. Sierra noticed the growing crowd outside her house and decided to pass off Aimia as a friend to deflect attention. Feeling tired, Sierra turned to Aimia and asked if she could support her for just 2 hours. Aimia, almost enchanted, immediately agreed. Sierra, in a joyful mood, sang a cheerful melody as she made her way to her room. She remembered the others waiting for her, her family and an unfamiliar guest, but decided that sleep was more pressing and would take care of them later. After a restful 2 hours, Sierra woke up, and her maid, Sofa, informed her that Lady Carnium was waiting for her in the living room. As Sierra prepared, Sofa gently combed her hair and mentioned that the unknown gentleman and her family were still waiting outside. Sierra told Sofa to keep them waiting a little longer since Aimia had been patient enough. Meanwhile, Aimia, enjoying desserts in the living room, was delighted by the treat's texture, crispy on the outside and soft inside. But suddenly, a thought struck her. She was sitting in the enemy's house, eating their cake. She reminded herself of how Sierra had humiliated her by making her wait 2 hours, but Aimia laughed off the thought, calling Sierra witch for charming her with her grace. Sierra knocked politely before entering the hall where Aimia was. As she walked in, her elegant dress drew Aimia's attention again. Though Aimia was tempted to protest, Sierra quickly stopped her, explaining that the desserts had been carefully prepared especially for her as a friend. She gently wiped crumbs from Aimia's face, showing her care and kindness. Aimia, blushing, asked if Sierra truly considered her a friend. Sierra smiled brightly and confirmed that she did, adding that Aimia was her first true friend. She shared her happiness, saying that she had one wish. Aimia, now imagining how close they would become, eagerly agreed to be friends with Sierra. Sierra then confessed that she didn't really understand what it meant to be friends and asked if Aimia could teach her. Aimia, excited to share her knowledge, gladly agreed, since this was the first time she'd ever had a real friendship, especially with someone like Sierra. Sierra, pleased with this, decided to use Aimia for her own plans and, in return, would use the same strategy with Mr. Herban. With a smile, Sierra turned to Aimia and said that now they were officially friends, so Aimia could visit her home anytime. Sierra reminded her new friend that the guests were still waiting outside, and as an understanding friend, Aimia should return home. However, Aimia firmly disagreed, insisting that friends should always do things together. She demanded that they meet her guests as a team. At first, Sierra was taken aback, but then, with a bright smile, she agreed. 10 minutes later, Sierra's father and brothers were finally granted entry into the mansion. Their faces were filled with excitement and anticipation as they entered, and they took their seats on one side of the room while Sierra and Aimia sat opposite them. Sierra started the conversation by asking why they had come to see her. Her father and brothers, visibly uneasy, exchanged worried glances. Meanwhile, Crown Prince Leandro was still being fawned over by the butlers, oblivious to the tension in the room. The Perrine family, known for their authority and influence, had long been rumored to have a flawless image that hid their cold, calculating nature. They were known for being emotionally distant and setting impossibly high standards for those around them. Sierra had always been different from them, but in order to survive within this family, she had played the role of a sweet, innocent girl. Now, sitting before her, her father and brothers appeared to genuinely care for her, but Sierra knew the truth. Only her mother, Ceste Marie Vader, had ever truly loved her. Her father and older brother looked at her with pity, clearly tormented by her current frailty. They had noticed her physical decline too late, and were regretful for not having paid more attention to her health earlier. The brothers, who were normally composed and cold, struggled to contain their emotions, with one of them almost on the verge of tears. When one of them began to speak, Sierra interrupted, her cold gaze silencing him. Her elder brother, noticing the tension, spoke up, explaining that they had come to apologize for the pain they had caused her. Sierra, her eyes wide with surprise, fell silent, allowing her brother to continue. She tilted her head slightly and asked if she was supposed to believe their words. Her brother, gathering his courage, admitted that Sierra didn't need to forgive them, but they were the ones who needed forgiveness. He confessed that, after hearing from their father, he realized that it wasn't Sierra who had been wrong, but them. He admitted that his hatred toward her mother, whom he had blamed for so many things in his childhood, was misplaced. Now, as he looked at Sierra, he saw his mother in her, and that realization caused him deep emotional turmoil. He and the other brothers, with sincere voices, asked Sierra for another chance and begged her to return to the estate to spend the remaining 3 weeks with them. Sierra, however, simply stared at them, her piercing gaze making them feel small and uncomfortable. She asked them, with a hint of irritation, if they truly loved her or if they saw her more as a reminder of their late mother. Her brothers, stunned by the question, could not find their voices. Sierra, wearied by their attempts, questioned again if they wanted her back simply to care for them as the last memory of their mother. It became clear to her that their sympathy was not for her but for their late mother's memory. She sighed, covered her face with her hand, and told them to leave. She added that their servants had always served her family, and she didn't want to humiliate them by kicking them out. Finally, she told them not to seek her forgiveness again, as she had no regrets. She had never desired their love, nor had she sought to love them in return. She smiled at them, apologizing if her words had offended them, and told them that now she no longer had to hide her feelings, for she was no longer attached to anything or anyone. The room fell into stunned silence. Count Perrine and his sons remained frozen, speechless and shocked by her response. Just then, the silence was broken by the sound of a servant entering, calling for Lady Sierra. The servant leaned in close, whispering important news into her ear. Sierra, momentarily stunned, stood up and announced that it was time for her to leave. She took Aimia's hands in hers, offering her a gentle, apologetic look, and explained that she had to leave because she had an important guest waiting. Sierra addressed her family one final time with a cold, harsh voice that made everyone present shudder. She directed her words toward her father, hoping he would seriously consider their meaning and take her opinion to heart. After delivering her thoughts, she slammed the door behind her and left the room. It was now Aimia who turned to face the Perrine family, breaking the awkward silence by expressing that they could have handled things better. Meanwhile, Sierra followed a servant who guided her directly to an important guest. Upon entering the room, her gaze landed on the Crown Prince, who was standing before her. He greeted her warmly, saying they had finally met, to which she whispered a respectful, "Your Highness," not taking her eyes off him. The Crown Prince had always seen Sierra as someone special. At balls, they often slipped away together for walks, and on birthdays, they exchanged gifts and heartfelt cards. Among all the nobility, the prince was the only one who personally wrote to Lady Sierra. Their relationship, which others considered casual, had become normal for them. However, if Sierra truly had feelings for him, their dynamic could not remain unchanged. The prince smiled at Sierra, commenting that she looked well. She responded with the same sentiment, and the prince was glad to hear it. He then reminded her of the days she had suddenly left without hearing his answer, leaving him to dwell on his thoughts. Sierra responded, saying that even if she had heard it, she would not have accepted his offer. The prince fell silent for a while, then asked how long she had been in love with him. Sierra admitted that she had been in love with him since the day they first met at the imperial palace. When the prince asked if it was from the first moment, when she had been crying and searching for her father, Sierra confirmed it. The prince, realizing that she had kept her feelings hidden for so long, asked why. Sierra explained that she had dreamed of marrying him, not as his mistress, but as his partner, his wife. She wanted to be close to the brightest star, yet remain someone who mattered even after death. Listening to her, the prince mentioned that he would soon need to choose a bride, and when that time came, he would choose her. Sierra smiled knowingly, and said that she had been preparing for that moment all along. The prince asked her to wait a little longer, but Sierra, with a hint of sadness, replied that she had already waited 15 years. The prince remarked that it hadn't been that long and asked if she regretted the time spent. Sierra answered that she didn't, as what happened was in the past. The next morning, Sierra abruptly woke up, eyes wide, and immediately got out of bed, surprising Sophie. She said they needed to get ready because they were leaving. Sitting in front of the mirror, Sierra asked Sophie to read the letters that had arrived. The first was an invitation to tea from Mr. Herbin, scheduled for 3 o'clock. The second was from Lady Carnium, inviting her to a party at 9 o'clock. The third was from Count Perrine, which made Sierra suddenly gloomy. She decided not to reply to this one. Sophie, curious, asked where Sierra was going so early in the morning. Sierra replied that she was heading to the Imperial Palace, which Sophie thought might be for a meeting with the Crown Prince. Sophie had seen the prince the night before, looking troubled after their conversation, and she felt sympathy for him. As Sierra adjusted her hat, she remarked that she had a bad feeling about the day ahead. Sophie didn't understand why, but Sierra explained that her unease stemmed from doubts about her father and brothers. While she trusted her family, she feared they might betray her. She hoped she would be able to handle things on her own without involving anyone else. For all of Sierra's 18 years, her family had always been rational to the core, yet they had continuously turned their backs on her. Her fists clenched in anger, and the intensity of her frustration made Sophie nervous, prompting her to ask Sierra to calm down. According to the documents, Sierra was still officially part of the Perrine family, so she decided to act immediately. She was going to go to the palace and renounce her identity. By 11:30 a.m., in the palace, the employees working in the library, the repository of all the kingdom's records, were engaged in their usual tasks. At that moment, a special guest arrived, Lady Sierra Perrine. She greeted them courteously and asked if there were any documents in the department that detailed the genealogical tree of all the noble families. The workers, taken aback, quickly asked how they could assist her. In a hurry, Sierra replied that she needed to see the most recent records of the Perrine family line. This request startled the staff, and they began to wonder if the Count had illegitimate children. One of the employees quickly located the Perrine family genealogy, placed it on the table, and showed it to Sierra. She asked him to open the last page and verify if her name was listed there. When the employee confirmed it, Sierra smiled sweetly and then made a shocking request. She wanted her name burned off the record with a cigarette. The workers were stunned and stared in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. One of them, unable to hold it in any longer, asked her to repeat her demand, which caused Sierra to become irritated. She repeated her request, adding that she didn't like to be asked the same thing twice. While similar situations had occurred before, usually with parents threatening their children, this was the first time that a countess had requested her own name to be erased. The workers, fearing they could be fired for such an action, informed Sierra that it wasn't something they could do on their own. Sierra asked them why, and one of the employees explained that they first needed to consult with higher management to determine the legality of her request. There was a tense silence in the room, and Sierra, growing impatient, asked if they could at least begin the process. The employee replied that they would need to wait for instructions from their superiors. The workers nervously fidgeted as Sierra stared at them in silence, her face partially covered by her hand as she nervously laughed, noting that she hadn't expected the process to be so difficult. Suddenly, she fainted from exhaustion, causing her maid and the workers to panic. By 2:45 p.m., Sierra had regained consciousness and was sitting on a cozy sofa at home when Kais arrived for the tea party. He immediately noticed her and remarked that he had heard about her fainting. Sierra, with her usual generosity, commented on how quickly rumors had spread, after only a few hours. Kais added that everyone was talking about it, but Sierra wasn't surprised. She replied, with some dark humor, that it was always the case. Then she wondered aloud what people would do when she was dead. Kais, looking more serious than ever, grew cautious at her words and asked if she was truly all right. Sierra didn't answer, her thoughts elsewhere, as she observed his serious expression. She mused if he would even manage to find a wife given how serious he always seemed. Sierra then bluntly asked him if he was worried about her. Kais immediately replied that he was, since they were friends. A bit embarrassed, Kais opened his mouth to speak, but Sierra beat him to it, saying that as friends, they should trust each other and give advice. She then asked if he wanted to know what was troubling her. Kais agreed without hesitation, and Sierra confided in him about her failed attempt to erase her name from the family records. Kais suggested that perhaps there was something wrong with the rules, given how upset Sierra was. Sierra replied that this had never happened before, so the procedure was far more complicated than she had expected. It would have been much easier if there had already been a case like hers. But Kais interrupted, telling her that she was mistaken. Such a case had occurred before. This piqued Sierra's interest immediately. She stood up, eager to hear more, and asked him to explain quickly and clearly. Kais revealed that the Herban family kept their entire history in their own library, a vast collection filled with books from floor to ceiling. When he was a child, Kais was often read from these records. He explained that when someone insulted the family's honor, their title was stripped. But there was one person who had wanted to be banished, and Kais knew exactly how he had achieved it. Sierra was pleasantly surprised to learn that such a case had indeed occurred before, and now, she saw a chance to make it happen for herself. She immediately asked Kais what would be required for her to sever her ties with the Perrine family. Kais responded that she would likely need the consent of her family. Sierra resolved to meet her father and asked Kais to accompany her. With Sophie in tow, they headed out. As they made their way to Count Perrine's estate, Sophie asked what Sierra intended to do. Sierra replied, with uncertainty, that she didn't know yet, but the most important thing was to start. Upon arrival, her father and brothers were overjoyed to see her, and even began to cry. Count Perrine was certain that his daughter loved them. Sierra gently called out to her father, and took his hand. As she did, she noticed that the Count didn't seem well, and asked if he was sleeping properly. The Count, overcome with emotion, was about to tell her everything when Sierra interrupted, reassuring him that she already knew. She looked at him tenderly and asked if he truly loved her. Her father, still crying, replied that of course he did, and her brothers joined in, also in tears. The Count even confessed that he loved only her, and no one else. Sierra, with crocodile tears in her eyes, then said that she had just one wish left, and that only her father could fulfill it. Her words and tears seemed to touch the Count deeply, and he urged her to tell him what it was. Still crying, Sierra asked him to grant her request, to sever all ties with the family. At first, the Count was caught off guard, but quickly, with a desperate desire to help, he agreed, saying he would tear those ties apart. Sierra then, with satisfaction, thanked her father for his willingness and noted how fervently he had responded. The Count, realizing the true nature of her request, was shocked and asked her to repeat herself. Sierra, pleased with her prank, repeated her demand, and her father was left speechless. She then turned to Kais and thanked him for being a witness, since he had heard everything. She asked him to sign the papers, and said that the Count would not back down on his word. The Count, realizing the gravity of the situation, signed the document that officially removed Sierra from the Perrine family. With Kais as a witness, Sierra thanked her father, then turned to her family, telling them not to come again. She coldly said that meeting them was a waste of her time. One of her brothers, outraged, yelled at her that if she chose to die without seeing them again, she should return everything that the Perrine family had given her, the servants, the house, and the money. The Count and the other brothers looked at him in fear, while Sierra remained silent. Sophie, sensing that things were about to escalate, knew that this confrontation would end badly. With cold detachment, Sierra told her brother to take everything if he wanted. Her brother, now more enraged, scolded her, saying that not everything in life worked the way she thought it did. Before he could continue, another brother interrupted him, laughing nervously and explaining that he had drunk too much the previous night and was still recovering. Sierra, reflecting on her brother's words, considered the financial implications. She knew that if she relied on her family's support, it would leave her in a hopeless position. However, she quickly decided to sell the house and the jewelry, which made her family uneasy. Her father, panicking, insisted that it was no longer summer, and that she couldn't leave without a home. At this point, Kais spoke up, telling them not to worry, as Lady Sierra could always ask the Herban family for help, since they were friends. Sierra, grateful for Kais' support, agreed, but Count Perrine did not like this suggestion. He questioned when his daughter had started relying on the Herban family. Sierra, unfazed, replied that much had changed in 18 years, and perhaps someday her father would have to turn to the Herban family for help. Her words hit her father hard. His younger brother, trying to defuse the tension, suggested that Sierra continue to live in the house and sell her unnecessary dresses and jewelry to pay rent, so she wouldn't owe them anything. Sierra found this proposal acceptable, and noted that at least her younger brother wasn't as foolish as the others. She then turned to leave, saying that was all. Her younger brother, bowing, said that from now on, he would pretend not to know her. Afterward, Sierra returned to the library. The worker confirmed that her name had been struck from the Perrine family records after reviewing all the documents she had gathered. Sierra let out a contented sigh, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer a Perrine, and all that remained was her name. She thanked Kais heartily for his help and invited him to a pajama party. Together, they headed back to her house, and Sierra apologized for dragging him into her problems. Kais waved it off, saying he had nothing else to do anyway. Sierra then asked what he was doing at the Herban estate. Kais explained that he had been training in the morning and was now handling tasks entrusted to him by his father, as a future Margrave. Kais had always considered his time in the capital crucial, but he still couldn't understand why his father had sent him there. There were no clear instructions, just a vague direction to meet people and make friends. Sierra, observing his confusion, realized that Kais had been taking things at face value and didn't fully grasp the situation he was in. People like him didn't have a place in the capital, yet the Herban family was an exception. No one would dare contradict them. Turning to Kais, Sierra told him she knew why the Margrave had sent him to the capital. It was because he wanted Kais to change. She added that everyone from the highest circles was aware of this. Sierra noticed Kais' lack of attentiveness. He hadn't picked up on the subtle cues from others. Kais admitted that he had indeed noticed something strange. People were behaving unnaturally around him. Sierra reached out and gently placed her hand on Kais' cheek, saying that any woman he fell in love with would inherit the gold and diamond mines of the Herban family. She then told him, in a direct and somewhat teasing tone, that he was young, handsome, strong, and honest, meaning every woman in the empire would want him. Her words visibly embarrassed him. She added that his father wanted him to marry, and with that, Kais finally understood the reason for his presence in the capital. Sierra was pleased to see him understand, but Kais, still unsure, asked about her, whether she would accept his offer. Surprised by the question, Sierra quickly responded that she would reject it. She would never accept his offer. Kais was silent for a moment, then remarked that what she had said earlier, that no woman in the empire would refuse his offer, was a lie. Sierra just smiled, confirming his suspicion with a simple nod. Kais, clearly disappointed by the rejection, became downcast. He decided to take her home, and the two of them got into the carriage together. Kais spent the entire ride looking sadly out of the window, while Sierra, sitting opposite him, was distracted and extremely sleepy. In her mind, she reflected on how she was probably the only woman in the empire who could turn down a proposal from Kais Herban. She briefly glanced at him, mentally asking for his forgiveness, but the truth was, she didn't regret anything. She was going to die soon, and there was no point in regretting anything. Meanwhile, in the imperial palace, the imperial family was gathered around the table, discussing important matters and the latest news from the capital. The emperor asked if it was true that Lady Sierra had erased her name from the Perrine family bloodline. The queen confirmed the news, while the crown prince, Leandro, was lost in thought. As his parents continued the discussion, he suddenly dropped his spoon, stood up, and shouted in bewilderment about why Sierra had done such a thing. He was furious that Count Perrine had allowed his daughter to leave the family, which shocked the queen and the emperor. Leandro's outburst continued as he angrily called the count crazy for allowing such a thing, which led to the queen sharply scolding him for his loudness. After calming down a little, Leandro questioned why Sierra would choose such a fate. The queen explained that according to imperial custom, women could not confess their love first, and this was the reason Sierra had been expelled from her family. The king slammed his fist on the table in frustration, proclaiming that Sierra was an innocent child who had been seduced by some scum, and they needed to find this person. But then, Leandro stunned everyone by admitting that this scum, Sierra had confessed to was, in fact, him. The king and queen were left speechless as their son ran out of the room, feeling ashamed that Sierra had been the first to confess her love to him. The king, still processing the situation, began to show a spark of interest at the possibility of marriage, while the queen reminded him that Sierra's situation was complicated. She had abandoned her family, lost her title, and now had no status. Moreover, there were rumors that she was planning to marry into the Herban family, which was the queen's primary concern. Back at Sierra's house, Kais was blushing and covering his face with his hands in embarrassment, while Sierra, not understanding his discomfort, remarked that it was normal for friends at parties to sit on beds together, eat, drink, and have fun. But Kais still felt uncomfortable, believing it was improper to be in the same bed with a woman before marriage. Sierra, meanwhile, noticed some crumbs on the bed and suggested they clean up later. Just then, Lady Carnium remembered the idea for a pajama party game, Truth or Dare, and invited everyone to join. Sierra, unfamiliar with the game, asked what it entailed, and Emilia quickly explained the rules. If someone didn't want to answer a question, they would have to drink instead. Emilia was the first to roll the dice and, to her delight, rolled a 1, meaning she could ask any question she wanted. She turned to Kais and asked if there was a girl in the capital who had taken a liking to him. Kais hesitated but eventually drank a glass of wine, which disappointed Emilia. However, she rolled again and, with another successful one, asked if the girl he liked had red hair. Kais firmly replied that no, she did not. This response made Emilia feel uncomfortable, and Sierra couldn't help but laugh, amused by the situation. Sierra, in her mind, noted how honest Kais was. Even though he had only drunk 1 glass, his head was already beginning to spin. It was now Kais' turn to roll the dice, and everyone eagerly watched as he rolled a 6. Emilia, grinning, asked Kais who he wanted to ask a question. Kais, his gaze immediately fixed on Sierra, was about to ask her something.